Thank you so much for being here. We're having a session with Ms. Manisha Sobrajani and Milo Ankha. Both of them work in remote areas, both of them work with highly complicated identities, highly complicated histories, and that's what we are going to discuss today. Just giving a brief introduction about Manisha. Manisha is a journalist, she's a researcher, she's a published author, she's worked with in highly hostile environments across India with a special focus on female gender, on the issues of trauma and reconciliation. Her books include The Land I Dream Of, The Story of Kashmir's Women, Forest of Tides, The Untold Story of the Sundarbans, and her upcoming book is Shadows of Azadi, Women's Lives in the Crucible of Kashmir. Milo Ankha here is an indigenous poet, artist, and writer from Zero, Arunachal Pradesh. She works across visual art, text, oral literature, performance, and other intuitive mediums. Her practice explores the intersections of gender, environment, indigenous worldviews, often reflecting on memory, identity, and ecological consciousness. Now, starting with you both, one question that I would like to ask both of you is to tell us a little bit about your work, because both of you have worked with hostile environments, be it a naturally hostile environment or a politically hostile environment. I would really like to know what inspired you to do this work. Why do you do what you do? And how did you actually choose such subject matter? And also, do you choose the subject matter or does the subject matter choose you? So, please. And also, what are your upcoming projects? What are you currently working on? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question to begin with, Maria. First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking SRM University for having me here. Am I audible? Is it better now? Okay. So thank you for having me here. And thank you for giving me the space to share my thoughts with all of you. You've asked me about my work, and having attended the first two sessions this morning, Volga's session and P. Satyavati's session, what I gather from those sessions is that the stories that they have written, the context may be age-old, but the narrative and the questions that the narrative brings out are contemporary, which is essentially women's place in the society and within their families. So it's the same for me. When I first went to Kashmir, I saw how hard the women worked there, and yet their opinion was the one that didn't really matter in the entire narrative. So that was my inspiration to work with the women. And while I work to bring dignity to the lives of communities that I interact with, I also attempt to bring forth their voices. So my work and my writing is essentially that. I bring out women's voices to a larger audience. And to your second question about, did I choose the work or did the work choose me? I would say it's both. The work chose me, and then I chose very consciously to pursue the work. Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you SRM for inviting me all the way from Arunachal Pradesh. And it's been a long journey, but I cannot complain. And thank you, Amlan. This question is, again, I think I'll have to go back from where it all started. I actually studied to be a dentist, and I practiced for 3 years. And the last year of my practice was in Arunachal Pradesh, which was a big life-changing move for me, because I used to walk to my clinic every day. And one of the observations was, when I used to come across the market areas, I used to come across so many people in the market. And one fine day, as I was walking to my clinic, I saw at least 4 to 5 women with blue-black eye in the market, and they were bargaining for the prices of the vegetables. That triggered me, in a way that I felt like if I was in their position, I would have been at home. I would never come out in the market so openly, nor would I care about what the prices of the sabji or anything was, but they were going on with their lives as if nothing happened to them. So this hurt me and pained me at the same time, went into a deep reflection mode about what all have I normalized in my life. I think every investigation, every introspection begins with that, like what is normal, what is not normal, who's told you what is normal, who's told you what is not normal. So I guess that was the beginning point of my journey to uh, do photography first, and then poetry came along. And so I used to always mix these mediums together and express myself through this language. And over time, I think I got into writing because there was so much that needs to be expressed beyond just short prose and also photographs. So writing came organically. I guess I became conscious of my work in a way that it was always a calling, and and for me, the only thing I could do was to acknowledge that work and surrender myself to it. So it's been quite a journey, and yeah. Is there any? What was the other question? Okay, the subject matter, I think I became a little more conscious after a few years into the field, and I realized that you need to have some kind of focus, some kind of discipline with the way you look at the world, the way things speak to you also. So gender was very, very personal. Ecology was always tied to my identity, where we come from. The nature is revered and it's central to our identity, it's central to our lifestyle, it's central to our festivals, our entire being. So I guess it's not very different or separate from the identity itself. So ecology and the worldview of the indigenous people.
Thank you, Manisha. Thank you, Ankha, for that. As Ankha was just saying, how difficult it is for women to navigate uh, even the basic needs to sort of gather basic needs. Like you were saying, how you were walking in the market and you saw women with a black eye or blue eye, and how you probably were sort of at a position where you could go back home, or if you were at their places, you could have gone back home. You would not have got out on the street or even spoken about the prices or bargained about the prices. So when you do actually work at such intersections of politics and gender, or environment and gender, since both of you worked with a gendered lens, with sort of with a focus on gender, and particularly in hostile environments, where people have complicated identities, complicated history, or there's tumultuous political conditions in the region. What sort of ethical considerations do you keep in mind when you are representing women who come from marginalized sections? You may or may not be from that marginalized section, but you are representing those women. What ethical considerations do you think of? What are some of the things that you keep in mind while you're representing them? How do they sort of complicate your understanding of a particular region? How do women complicate or transform your understanding of them, of certain regions that are complicated, that have complicated identities or tumultuous politics? And what are some of the ethical considerations that you keep in mind while writing about such women? And that's a question to both of you.
I think as creators or as thinkers, or while we're in a creation phase or something, a lot of our ideas, we tend to project it back to the society. We want it a certain way, so we make our perspective in that direction, and we look at all the events from that perspective. I think that is one thing that I have learned, is to deconstruct my own biases, deconstruct my own understanding of the life of people around. More importantly, for me, it was important to always be on the ground and work with them, along with them, rather than separating each other uh, uh, as a writer, as a photographer, or with people. So I felt that one of the ethical scenes that I feel is that the consent is the most important. Like if they do not consent, but I also have sense that in most of the situations, consent is not really given to them. They don't understand the concept of consent. So it's important to navigate that situation first and then enter the space and then connect with them and then actually be able to give it back in a way that is the most relatable. So for me, that is one which is a must go. The rest, I feel like I'm always careful about what I project into people, like to ideas, to projects, or anything, and how much of it is sounds like me, how much of it is actually reality, or how much of it is fictional. So I think acknowledgement is the first thing that I do, and to just break down also in my process. Yeah.
Just to add in a little bit before Manisha, you answer the question. Apart from ethical considerations that she was talking about, do you think uh, representing women also complicate the understanding of certain regions, as I already said? Like, does it transform your understanding of Kashmir, let's say, because you worked extensively on Kashmir? Does it transform it? Does it complicate it? Representing women from hilly areas, from remote areas, from politically complicated areas, and there could be two sides of the same story. And when you are narrating the women's story in particular, do you think it helps you change understanding of certain regions politically, socially, or it sort of is the same? And then also about the ethical considerations that I just asked, if you could add a certain thing to it.
Sure. Allow me to share a little vignette from my first visit to Srinagar. I was doing a workshop with a group of women, and when we took a tea break, this middle-aged woman took me aside. She took my hand and she put my hand inside her farron, her shirt. She didn't have breasts. She said, the militants chopped them off. And I didn't know how to respond. I did not know how to react. I still don't know how I feel about it. That incident changed the meaning of the word dignity for me. So, to answer your question, yes, it is anyway representing an area like Kashmir is complicated. Representing the women of Kashmir through my work is doubly complicated. So, when I am writing about it, I am very mindful of how I portray them, how I may be able to present them in a way that does not rip them off their dignity, of how I experienced it. The other thing, and I often battle with this question myself, is as a researcher, I go out into the community and I take what I want. Am I able to give anything back? I don't know. I still don't know. I struggle with that question. So, yeah, I am mindful of it. These are the things I keep in mind when I write about a region like Kashmir.
Actually, drawing on what you just said, how the meaning of dignity sort of changes for you when you enter a place like Kashmir, or for that matter, Arunachal, with complicated histories, complicated identities. Was there any movement in your careers that you felt you were talking to a certain person and they shared something so grotesquely disturbing that you probably thought that, why am I doing this at all? I probably should take a step back and not do this. Is it crossing that certain line of ethics? Is it crossing a certain boundary that I probably should look back and think if I should be doing this at all? Should such stories even be told out in public? Or is it my story to tell? That's a very important sort of question, because you are telling other people's stories who probably cannot tell it themselves. So is it your story to tell?
This is a very interesting question. You know, like often when I go into people's home and etc. For photography or for writing or just hear them out and have an word to word, you know, face to face conversation, uh, I come across this idea, or I feel that a lot of them want to be heard and want to be seen. Most of them want to be heard and want to be seen. And when you make time for that activity, you just sit with them and like transfer these stories, transfer these ideas, transfer the experiences. Something is freed there. For me, that is the most magical moment. And when that thing is freed, the block is freed, you connect with them directly. So when that connection happens, these questions are no longer valid for me. At that point, I feel that transfer is so pure that they have trusted you, they have valued you with their experiences. And I think this is also coming from my experience as working as a dentist, working with communities across ages, across backgrounds, that I've learned to be a good listener. I've learned to, like, we were trained in a way to like hear them out first and then see what it is that we need to intervene or how we need to go forward with that. That practice has still been going on for me, but in another way. But the moment when after all of that conversation, and then I go ahead to write about it or take that photograph, that in a way also gives both the parties closure, I feel. So for me, that is the connection that is sort of driving to tell these stories that needs to be told. So
So, first of all, it's a privilege to be able to sit across someone and hear their stories, which are deeply, deeply personal. And I have been very lucky to have found families and homes that have adopted me. So, for me, the question becomes slightly layered in the sense that if this were truly my blood family, would I share their stories? How would I feel about it? And if I'm sharing the stories, does it mean that they are less of a family to me than my blood family? And if I'm not sharing their story, would I how would I consider them? Then what am I doing here? So that balance, I guess you always have to find, and it's each story to its own. I don't think there's a common answer to that one. Yeah.
I'd just like to add, I think there is also a certain time when you process this thing. No, that is the most important part of doing what you do. That when you go back after an interview or after visiting somebody, you process what's happened. You process your own process. You question your own process. You have these breakdowns, and it takes a long time for us also to accept ourselves for who we are, and then that also gives that much of grace and space to accept the other person also for what their stories are. So I guess it's symbiotic in nature, and only if they allow you can do it. Otherwise it's there's no point in trying to scrap things out. Yeah.
I think this question also brings us to a larger question of the authenticity. What is authentic and what's not authentic? Like Ankha, you are from Arunachal, you live there, and you also work on the communities from Arunachal Pradesh. While as Manisha, you work on Kashmir, though even though you're not a Kashmiri. So when you kind of deal with these questions of insiders and outsider, insider versus outsider. So whose account do you think, or if there at all is a question of reliability, whose accounts are more reliable? What kind of challenges do you face as an insider as well as an outsider, quote unquote insider, quote unquote outsider, while representing the stories of people that you do not belong to and the people that you actually belong to? How do you deal with your biases? Like Ankha, because you work in Arunachal, you may have your own biases because those people are yours, you belong to that community. While as Manisha, you might have a different kind of a bias. It's not an insider bias exactly. How do you deal with those biases while writing, and how does it affect your writing process? How does it also affect you as a human being, as a writer, while you are listening to the stories? Like you said, you went to many families and they told you their stories. How do you kind of absorb those stories, considering the fact that you do not belong to this land? and you have not gone through what they have gone through. And in your case, entirely the opposite. You do belong to that land, and you might have gone through a lot of things that they have gone through. So how do you deal with these questions? How do you deal with these biases?
Obviously, when you do work like this, you're very aware of your position. First is to acknowledge your position, that whether you're an insider or an outsider, it's very simple. With that acknowledgement, you have a lot more to go ahead. I think with the biases in like for me to kind of pan out the biases also, my work is usually slow. It's usually I go on multiple visits and I do a lot more reflecting than producing work or creating work, because I'm not in a rush to kind of find a narrative or not to find a closure. For me, it's more about the process, that what is happening in the in-betweens also. I think there's a lot of learning that happens to understand your own biases, to understand your own gaze, your conditioning, everything that you've been taught, whether it is through an institutional phase or not, or where you must have come across information that is available so much, right? There are other biases where I feel that I'm not the right person to tell this story. For instance, everybody here is aware about Zero Music Festival. Yes. It's a big festival. It's a boom festival. Like, in over 12 years, it has boomed. I know the kind of effect it has had on the community and the ecology, but I'm not the right person to tell it. And I will openly tell it to my friends that you, being an outsider, will be the right person to talk about this, because there are some stories that the locals or the people, us, will have, they listen to the somebody from outside coming and telling this. They need an outsider's perspective to tell you that this is what is happening. While the insider is also like struggling to tell the same story, you will be denied or you will be shot at in the first go only. Like they'll be like, you're from the community, so you don't say anything. When it's somebody else, there's always this validation also that comes with who the storyteller is and why do they tell the stories. So in case of this is just an example. Like there are so many other tales where I feel that I'm not the right person to tell, and I acknowledge that. And it's not my weakness, or it's not my, I'm not like trying to be like, I have to tell all the stories from the community. There are some points where I know that this is not my line to cross, because in the end, I also have to live with them, So there is a lot that will be at stake just for the sake of you going out and sensational stories to put out them, no? So.
To build on what you said, Anka, you said that we process, first of all, the stories in our own time. And I'll take the liberty of saying this for the both of us. In the kind of work that we do, we have to, in a way, allow our heart to break every day and to see what the people go through, and then to be able to process it, and then to be able to reproduce it, if I may, in different ways. It takes a lot. And the question of insider, outsider, Anka spoke very well about how it is to be an insider and to be reporting from within the community. For someone like me who's not a Kashmiri and works in Kashmir, again, I may be able to see things which an insider may not be able to see. I may be sensitive to things that, let's say, a person living in Kashmir may take it as part of life. To me, it may be completely, it may be a violation of every basic human right. And at the same time, I may or may not get the nuances of the life in Kashmir as a Kashmiri lives it. So it's both ways, I suppose. And at the end of it, whether an insider or an outsider, like I said, we have to let our hearts break. But if we do see our hearts mend even a little bit every day, every week, every month, I think that makes it all worthwhile. Yeah.
So also like there's one example that I'll give about this whole insider-outsider debate. In the community that I come from, Apatani community, we have facial tattoos. I don't know how many of you can also Google and do the Wikipedia now from Zero community. We have face tattoos and we have nose plugs. So that has been our identity, okay? And a lot of people initially now SRM has like a big scope for researchers in even in like near future also. Lately from Northeast, few researchers have been coming out and it's catching up. At least in Arunachal Pradesh, I think the last 10 years have been really fruitful for research and it's been coming out. What has it done is given voice back to the insiders. So there, what has happened is, for example, there's a narrative on the Wikipedia page that lot of us women were tattooed to make ourselves look ugly. You know, there was a whole debate on what beauty is, what is ugly, why did we tattoo ourselves in the face? Was it to make ourselves look ugly so that the neighboring tribes will not kidnap us? That was a narrative and that was an outsider's perspective and somebody put it on Wikipedia and for the longest time, even till today, lately also Vogue has published a story which was corrected by the community, even Outlook has published. All the big magazines, all the big publications have been re-repeating these tales over and over and over. It's done and dusted, but they have been bringing up this narrative over and over again. Now what's happening is on the ground, a lot of researchers are arguing this statement and they're saying that how can it be about ugly, like what is the actual meaning of this thing? And a lot of elders say that it's always been part of our identity. It was never about the beauty standards and somebody else projected their idea of beauty standards onto us. So now there's a lot of course correction happening in those narrative also. So sometimes like it can act both the ways. I feel like an outsider narrative can also be a catalyst, and while the insider narrative eventually has to come out, you know, like to assert their position and their own narrative. So, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for actually clarifying a lot of things here, because this debate sort of comes up very frequently in literature, that who actually can tell your story? Who has the moral right to tell your story? Is it us, it's the people, or is it the people who actually look at us more objectively than we look at ourselves? But I suppose there was a little bit clarity here. Manisha, it kind of brings me to one of the very important questions of the session, which I think I spoke to you already about. You have, in your books, you've written about Kashmiriyat, quote unquote Kashmiriyat. First of all, I would really like to know what your definition of Kashmiriyat is. Also, to sort of complicate the question, I might add in a few details. I suppose in popular culture, in media, in social media, we see an image being floated that Kashmir is this piece of heaven with beautiful people, with very hospitable people, very submissive people also at the same time. So popular media or popular culture puts Kashmir on a pedestal, puts Kashmiris on a pedestal as well. And then Kashmiris are also kicked out of that pedestal as soon and as quickly, as conveniently as possible, and as is convenient for the mainstream media or as is convenient for the popular culture. So my idea or my understanding of Kashmiriyat is exactly this, that how people of Kashmir are sort of put on and off throne as per the convenience of the popular culture or popular media. And if anything goes south, anything goes wrong, even the slightest thing, we see Kashmiri students being beaten up in campuses, we see a lot of political turmoil taking place, we see a lot of law and order issues. So how do all of these things complicate your idea of Kashmiriyat? Does it affect your idea at all? Or you completely understand Kashmiriyat from the experience that you've had living in Kashmir or you've had working with Kashmiris? So just to add in to that, and also I would really like to know, to sort of add into this whole debate, I would like to know, do you think over tourism in Kashmir, or tourism being a very exploitative industry in Kashmir, do you think that also affects your idea of Kashmiriyat, or it also affects your idea of the place, your idea of the people who actually live there?
So this is a many layered question, and I'll try to answer it in bits and pieces. So to answer what Kashmiriyat means to me, Kashmir is a melting pot of communities, of different faiths, different ideas. But most importantly, to me, Kashmiriyat is a lot of love that I've received with the community, received from the communities that I've worked with, in the areas that I've worked with. And I was thinking, as you were speaking, I was thinking what it means to me. So I think I would define it in terms of how my experiences have changed in Kashmir over the past 18 odd years that I've been working there. And I've worked in almost all the districts of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh. So when I first went to Kashmir, this was 2004. After, I think, 4:35 in the evening, it was not possible to step out of your hotel, and you had to keep your eyes lowered at all times, and you couldn't talk to anyone, and you just had to do your work and go back for various reasons. This was 2004. And 2012, I drove from Ladakh to Srinagar on my own, all by myself. And I think I arrived in Srinagar around midnight, and I went to the hotel that I was living in. So to me, that was quite a drastic change. So 2004 was also Kashmiriyat. 2012 was also Kashmiriyat. And both the experiences were very, very different. Again, in the early 2000s, when I first started working there, one would hear the call to prayer, the azan, every few times a day, especially in the evening, the Maghrib Namaz. And again, 2010, I was living in a friend's home. I woke up to the sound of the Pandit singing the Aarti in the temple next to his house. So to me, 2004 was also Kashmiriyat, and 2010 was also Kashmiriyat. So it's a very deeply personal term for me. And I'm now forgetting all the other things you asked, so maybe you can repeat them, please.
Like how popular media or popular culture puts Kashmir on a pedestal.
Oh, yes.
Based on
Oh,
their
yes.
convenience and based on the political circumstances, but we are also kicked off
Yes.
as conveniently, as quickly as it is. So does that affect your understanding of Kashmir and its people, or sort of the political idea of Kashmir it is as it is? Because Kashmir is a highly political place, and we cannot probably look at Kashmir and overlook its politics.
Absolutely. So, like you said, the image of Kashmir is lovely apples, beautiful women, green valleys. All of that is there, but the way it's portrayed is not okay. And how it shows up is very strange to me. I was doing a workshop with a group of children from India and Pakistan at a school in Dehradun. And the children, when I asked them when I say the word Kashmir, what does it mean to you? Their responses were so different, and they were in a way so hostile. It was a group of children from schools from across the country. So children from Kashmir obviously said different things. Children from Delhi said different things. Children from Pakistan said entirely different things. So to me, that was an eye-opener as to what Kashmir means to the world outside of Kashmir, and how it is played into their minds, the image of Kashmir. And when you talked about people being labeled as overly, sorry, what did you say? Hospitable, yes. again, to me, that's very personal. I have been invited into homes of strangers who have become family, and likewise, they have become my family and they come into my home. So, yes, Kashmiris are very hospitable. It all depends on how they are portrayed and who is portraying them, right? The media and to a great extent, the research narratives also have changed over the years. So, does that answer your question?
Thank you so much, Manisha. Thank you so much. I was really looking forward to that question, actually. Anka, coming back to you. Since you work with ecological questions, you work across indigenous communities, how do you think developmental discourse fits into this narrative? To explain what I mean by developmental discourse, how do you feel about these very ambitious government projects of making multiple lane highways, of making all these railway links to really remote places? Do you think that affects the, how do you think it affects the indigenous communities? How do you think it affects the ecology of the place, of very fragile places like Arunachal or other Himalayan belts that are already facing a lot of climate change issues, a lot of change in the weather patterns? Because you do work at the cross section of ecology and gender, so I might probably ask you this: how does it change the livelihoods of people? Does it change the livelihoods at all? And do you think tourism industry has a part to play in this overtly development of places that probably need to be left alone, that are too fragile to have multiple lane highways or railway links built into them? So this whole destruction of climate, this whole destruction of mountains that probably were meant to be left untouched. So do you think tourism and all these really ambitious projects sort of complicate your understanding of how ecology is getting destroyed?
As I was making my way to Vijayawada, from the flight, you can see the fields, and so many of these fields are soon going to be lost to buildings. You know, it's the reality. This is what it is. No matter how much you want to romanticize the world and want its trees, you want to preserve the mountains, the lakes and waters, you see, over time, the people are going to take over. Their ambitions, their dreams are going to take over. In Arunachal, over the years, I have seen how the people used to complain of having no roads. Now they have roads, but those are bad roads. And now we are losing the mountains and the rivers and everything. Everything is compromised step by step, and nobody tells you what to do later because our elders never told us this is going to be it. We are the ones who went out of the state, saw the world, came back, and we're terrified to see this happening. And that has caused a huge, there is this word called solastalgia, which is coined by an Austrian or Australian scholar called Glenn Albrecht. And solastalgia is a nostalgia for home. Like there is a homesickness for a space that you once knew about, and that includes, for us, it includes the trees, it includes the mountains, the lakes, the ponds, everything. Soon it will be for Vijayawada also the fields that are around, lying around to be claimed by real estate agents and mafias, etc. I think over time the government projects have dented the community more than it should have united us in the name of development. And most of them, as we know today, with what is happening with the Siang Dam project, Dibang projects, all of these dam projects are coming in Arunachal. There are like 5 to 7 rivers, and all of them are being claimed for dams and developments. But the real question is, what has the community? What has it done to the community? There is in the ground, there is a lot of conversation happening around who is to be relocated where. The communities are going to be relocated. In near future, they're going to be in the upstream, they're going to be in downstream. All of these are terrifying to like even address them at this point also. So I think there is definitely loss of these cultural values. There is loss of this lifestyle values. It has definitely dented the communities, and even today, not many of us can be vocal about it. And even to be sitting here and telling this is also a big risk that I will be taking. But yeah, this is definitely happened. Tourism is a very smart move to kind of cover it up. So it's a blanket term for us that like tourism is coming. Okay, tourism is coming, which means they lure you with the opportunities and the money that comes along with tourism. But over time, I have seen what it has done. Like in a place like Zero, which was discovered for Zero Music Festival, initially it was only fields and fields and fields. And I remember like having to look at the fields without a sight of a building. You can look at the sight of the mountains directly. But now when you look at the fields and you look at the mountains, you have to bend your neck and like, just go see through the buildings to look at the mountains. And over time, what has happened when you're looking at a cultural lifestyle also, what it does is, for example, the music scene has really boomed in Arunachal. There are 101 festivals happening every year. So you imagine of a place like Jiro where there has been only farming communities and farmers. So you're attending to a certain class, a certain section of people, and then you bring in your intervention of music, and boom, you bring in all the tourists, you bring in all the so and so of everything that caters to that industry. Now you're creating a class divide, and this has dented the community so much that the children are harassing their parents to afford a ticket to go and attend that music festival. And how much is this music festival costing you per day? 4,000, 5,000. It goes on. Weekends, it goes even above. So how are you supposed, what is the aspiration of the future? What are we showing to the children or like to the younger crowd? Because they will definitely fall into the peer pressure and everybody wants to be part of the game. But then in the end, it's only those who are coming and like doing it for the sake of capitalistic point of view. They are getting what they get, and then in the end, they just leave it on us to figure out what we have to do with the rest of the destruction that has already happened. Um, it's a very sad question for me to answer every time I go, and I it just hurts. Yeah.
Before we open the floor to the audience for questions, since we are talking about literature, I might ask a question to both of you. Who is your favorite author, and what is the favorite work or a favorite piece of novel or poetry that you read very often or that you grew up reading? What's the favorite one? If there is a favorite one at all, there could be multiple also. That's fine.
Okay, since I'm coming from Arunachal Pradesh, I'll take Mamang Dai's name. She's been very instrumental in shaping up my mind, my ideas about the place, the stories that she's been writing. Black Hill is definitely one of my favorite book, and I fell in love with the protagonist, and I cried when he died. So it was really personal and very cathartic process for me to go through with her books, as well as the poetry, which has so much of life in it, and everything in her poem speaks to me. Like it can be just a blade of grass, or it can be like a bird in a flight. Everything comes out really alive with her poems, and her imagery is stunning, and she's been my favorite writer for quite some time now. So yeah, to you.
For me, it depends on my state of mind, and I have many authors and poets that I look to in my various moments of happiness, despair, sorrow, grief, depression, etc. Um, William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience is my go-to for everything. Elif Shafak's 40 Rules of Love is a book that I have revisited so many times. Lal Ded's poetry inspires me every single day. Mirabai's poems also are a go-to. It totally depends, yes.